Good evening, everyone. I'll call this meeting to order at 6:30, asking everyone to please silence cell phones and other electronic devices, and I'll do the same while I'm saying that. Yeah, and just to note that all members of council are present in the chambers with the exception of Councillor Fredis, who is joining us electronically this evening. So it is 6:30 p.m. I'll call this meeting to order by recognizing the traditional keepers of this land and specifically our neighbors of the Alderville First Nation with a formal territorial acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that the Municipality of Brighton is located on the Mississauga and Anishinaabe territory and is the traditional territory of the Mississauga. The Council of the Municipality of Brighton respectfully acknowledges that the Mississauga Nations are the collective stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity, and that they continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure their health and integrity for generations to come. Moving to the approval of the agenda, it's moved by Deputy Mayor Anderson, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon, that Council approve the March 20th, 2023 planning meeting agenda as presented. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Members of council, do you have any declarations of pecuniary interest? And if so, please state the general nature thereof. There are none noted. We have one delegation this evening. Delegates have 10 minutes to provide council with their information. It is noted that language, content, and conduct must remain respectful at all times. Council will be provided with an opportunity to ask questions of clarification from the delegation representative based on the information that they've presented. Council is reminded that this is not an opportunity to engage in debate with the delegate or advance a public policy position. Delegates are reminded that council does not make decisions during the delegation portion of this evening's meeting. CAO Bateman from the Lower Trent, welcome.
Thank you very much. So again, thank you, Mayor Ostrander and councillors. It's nice to be back. Wasn't that long ago that I was here. And the slide package is on slide number 2. Oh,
hang on for just a sec.
I will.
Dealing with a minor technical glitch, I think. There we go.
Here it is.
There we go. Back over to you.
Great, thank you. Could advance the slide one, please. Thank you. So as we know, Bill 23 passed on November 28th, and some sections of Bill 23 affected the Conservation Authorities Act. And those were enacted on December 28th with an effective date of January 1st. So most of us were on Christmas holidays when that came through. So when we came back to work, it was a lot of quick hustling to get things under control and figure out what this means. So the first slide here is relevant to the Category 2 programs, which apply to those programs that are of municipal responsibility that are carried out through conservation authorities. So LTC has had planning agreements with all of our municipal partners and one of our county partners as well. So this exception that we should not provide within our area of jurisdiction a municipal program or service related to reviewing, commenting on a proposal, application, or other matters made under a prescribed act, that exemption does not apply to natural hazards or wetlands. So next slide, please. So as mentioned, the prescribed acts, there's 10 of them. LTC has a capacity to provide comments and recommendations to our municipal partners on several of these acts, but primarily we worked under the Planning Act. For example, the Ontario Water Resources Act and the Planning Act together were the basis for us supplying information and recommendations on stormwater management. Next slide, please. So other programs and services, those are our Category 3 programs, which apply that are CA centered, but may and would be of benefit to our municipal partners, and they will require an agreement between CAs and municipalities. So the exemption here prohibits commenting on other acts that have been agreed upon by municipal partners previously. So of those acts over here, I'll use an example. So some of the larger CAs, say the Toronto CA, may have an agreement with their municipalities to comment on Environmental Assessment Act, Endangered Species Act, that sort of thing. So some of the bigger bigger CAs developed a capacity to take on those responsibilities, and the municipalities had agreements with them for that. So they're no longer allowed to do that either. And next slide, please. So the consequences of these changes. So as I said, happened on July 1st or January 1st. We are not to review or comment on planning proposals or any applications associated with natural heritage matters. So things like species at risk, the Oak Ridges moraine, significant woodlands, wildlife, etc., which we did under our previous agreement with the municipalities. So we remain responsible to review and comment on planning applications related to natural hazards and matters under our regulation. And everybody knows that regulation name, so I don't have to say it. So what are the results of this after we got this information, had to digest it? We immediately started having meetings with our municipal and county planning staff. First of all, to figure out what it is, the Conservation Ontario, so all the conservation authorities got together and tried to figure out what this means for us and how it affects our municipalities. So after we had those discussions, we had multiple meetings with our municipal and county planning staff. So we identified and distributed, and we were talking about this last time I was here, we were developing this list of LTC list of services that has been distributed to our municipal partners. We have discussed a realignment of operations for planning applications, and we're still working with municipal staff to ensure the transition was as smooth as possible. Any application we received prior to January 1st, 2023, we continue to work through the process because we had the applications, we were already working on them, and that I think we're finished. I can't say that with conviction, but I think we're finished working through them. One of the other results of this, at the same time as we got this, no longer will you be working on natural heritage matters, the minister froze our fees for 2023. So the change in our planning operations was announced after we had already set our fees. Our fees were set effective December 1st of 2022. However, there's an unintended consequence now that the minister's order results in the public or developers are paying fees indicated for delivery of less service when it comes to our planning applications. We're all in the same boat, and we're not allowed to change them. They're frozen. So it's something that is difficult to swallow, even for us. I mean, we don't want to have people paying for services that they don't receive, but there's a lot of aspects under the Planning Act that still require our planning staff to look at. So it's not like you're getting nothing for money, you're getting something, but not as much as you would have in the past. So other notable changes under Bill 23 is identification of CA lands or portion of CA lands that would be suitable for development. So the properties and portions of properties would be included in our conservation land strategy that is due by the end of 2024. That's worrying. But at first glance, most of our properties are either floodplain, hazard lands, wetlands, or have been subject to restoration works, thereby limiting development options. We haven't gone deep into this yet, but we will. And it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of it, because there's no definition of what developable lands really are. Do they want to see it within a municipal service area? Do they want to see any, rural residential? I'm not sure. We've got, as I say, we have no indication of that from the province at this point. So there's other aspects of Bill 23 to the CA Act that have not been enacted, including some additional planning aspects. We're hoping that those don't come to fruition, or if they do, that they'll be geographically centered and not affect areas outside the GTA. The development regulations are and have been up for review for the past 5 years. I think I've said that every time I've come here. We do anticipate them being released this year. at least fractions thereof. And I know I've said that every time, but it's not me holding it up, it's the province though. Next slide, please. Oh, yes. So that's the end of the effects of Bill 23 at this point. And I have a few slides about the program services inventory and agreements. So should I continue or
Let's finish the
Okay.
presentation and then we'll turn the mics over to members of council for questions of clarification.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Ron.
Okay, thank you. So as you can see from the, next slide, please. As you can see from this slide, the new categories of programs are category 1, which are mandated programs, and they're covered by the municipal levy that you pay, LTC. And it includes natural hazards, which is natural hazards planning, development regulations, permitting enforcement, flood forecasting and warning, and flood and erosion control structures. That's a lot of things under that one envelope, and it's a major portion of what we do. Conservation management lands, the provincial monitoring programs, source protection, and corporate services. Source protection currently is not paid under municipal levy, it's paid by the province. Category 2 are the categories that are required by the municipality to be delivered, but we've had agreements to deliver them on behalf of the municipality, and Brighton has risk management official inspector and source protection education completed at LTC. The flood and erosion control infrastructure is not of concern for Brighton. And our category 3s, we're hoping that Brighton will support our water quality monitoring. That's local water quality monitoring, which is currently paid by levy. Youth education and our stewardship and outreach category 3 initiatives. All of these would be relatively low cost, with the highest being youth education. So 2 of these programs, the water quality monitoring and the stewardship, are currently being addressed. They exist under the current levy. I don't have the full cost determined yet, but we're working on that, and we'll have them soon for consideration when we bring agreements forward, potential agreements forward. We're bringing our revised program and services inventory to our board at their April meeting to address the changes in our new formats for category 1s, 2, and 3. Some of them are corrections. Some of them now with Bill 23, we have to take some of our services out of our inventory. So the youth education it would basically be a 0.5 of an FTE. So our education programs are covered under source protection, and the other, so 25% it would be source protection. The other, and 25% would be education around hazards. And then the 0.5 FTE would be youth education. And when I come back to talk about the agreements and stuff in full detail, we'll have a lot of examples of our youth education, including the Children's Water Festival that everybody loves, and, you know, Apple Fest and all the rest of that good stuff. And next slide, please. So our current category 2 agreements would be, as I said, similar to those currently in place. So there's only 2. And category 3 would be cost apportioned based on municipal participation. Our category 3 programs are watershed wide, and I'm hoping that we have that capacity to move forward on a watershed basis, especially for youth education. So we're developing the agreements now. I have a draft on my desk, and we're collaborating with the other conservation authorities in the east to make sure that we have a similar formatting. Then we'll consult with the municipalities this spring. I know today is spring as of right now, but it won't be too long. And we're hoping for council approval by early summer. So I'll be bringing these back to staff first, I believe, and then discussing options. And that's it.
Thank you, CAO Bateman. Questions of clarification from members of council. Councilor Rowley.
Mayor, Rhonda, always a good presentation, sometimes confusing on the way things are going now. Could you just clarify the source water protection that you talked about that was in category 1? Will you still be looking after that for us?
Yes. So source water protection falls under the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Water and we are the largest source protection region by number. So Lower Trent is the lead CA, and we have 4 other conservation authorities that make up the Trent Conservation Coalition. And MECP is currently funding it and has from the beginning, and we're hoping that they continue to do so. The commitment right now is for them to continue, but as I probably said before, we don't know whether that's going to continue because they have created enabling legislation to download it to our municipalities.
So then
Go
that
ahead.
would be costing the municipality if
Oh,
if
yes.
this,
Would
we'd
be,
be paying extra.
You'd be paying extra, and we would, because we are the lead CA, we would be getting money from the other 4 CAs to run the program coordination as well. So my dog and pony show is going to get much, much bigger if I have to go to Peterborough and Kawartha and Port Hope and to get money. It's not a good model. What's working now works, and it's great. And we didn't know how or when it would be I'll say downloaded because that's what it is. And if it is downloaded, they can do it now because of the enabling legislation they put in place. It's not good news.
what would it take? A regulation, order in council, minister's order? What do you know?
It's a regulation.
Okay.
It's
So-
already in place.
The regulation's already in place?
Yep.
Oh, so it could just the stroke of a pen of the minister?
Yep.
Well, we'll have to be in touch with the minister.
Please do.
Deputy Mayor.
I realize how the municipality and our taxpayers are gonna have to foot the bill for so much more. And we're supposed to be building houses faster, and we're supposed to be making things more affordable. The province forgot about what their mandate was. How does it affect the developer on this, other than it's going to cost us, the municipality, more? What about the developer? Because they also deal with the, I'm looking at one of them right now, hoping he could answer. But how does it affect them? And they have to deal with your agency as well to come up with the answers, and when they're planning and thinking ahead and all that. How is it going to affect them?
As it affects, there's really no change in how it affects them and their relationship with us. We have, the planning applications come in, we comment on them and send them back, but our comments are limited to natural hazards and wetlands. So there is going to be an effect, because I'm not sure how long it's going to take for the municipality to get the comments back or peer review done.
It's going to slow.
It's gonna slow it
the
down.
Process down immensely.
Yes.
I think, and the cost will, yes, it'll be on the taxpayer and the municipality. But if we're all in this together to move along and make things more affordable and build more homes,
Mhm.
this is not. I feel for the developer, and I feel definitely for the taxpayer. Anyway, anyone else?
Councillor Wielden?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you. The things that Lower Trent is no longer allowed to comment on, what kind of how many people would we need to hire as consultants in order to replace the services that we were getting from Lower Trent?
That's hard to say. It depends on how much development is happening and the scope of the development, because we have 7 municipalities that we're commenting on. So to isolate it down to Brighton, I couldn't do that off the top of my head, but I think your planning department would be better to answer that question.
Director Walsh, has your team put their collective mind to that?
Through the mayor and council, not specifically taking inventory per se, but historically, when subdivision control was first downloaded on municipalities, and I am dating myself here a little bit, where I was prior, we had no conservation authority about half our jurisdiction, so we did have to rely on external resources, and we went to more or less one-stop shopping, larger consulting firms who had to bring in subcontractors, so to speak, in different specialties to be able to provide the full service needed.
So more consultant costs is what we may be looking at.
That's correct. And I think council will be seeing a report later in the agenda looking at impacts of Bill 23 and saying these would be the next steps for municipality is to do an RFP in the areas of EIS and stormwater management in order to fill the gap that would be left by the Bill 23 exclusions of conservation authorities.
We all know how much the taxpayer loves the word consultant too.
Yes, and ironically, we'll be relying heavily on the terms of reference law Trent have drafted for us in both of these regards. So
Shocking. Yeah, thank you.
We will continue to support our municipalities with things like terms of reference and anything we can help them with, because we still have the expertise in-house. We just can't do exactly what it says there.
Well, Brighton appreciates that, and I have no doubt your other member municipalities will as well. Any other questions from members of council?
It's not my fault.
It's not your fault. No one's blaming you.
I always feel like I'm coming here with bad news every time.
You're just the messenger. We get it. Motion is moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon, that council receive the presentation from Rhonda Bateman, CAO, Lower Trent Conservation Authority regarding Bill 23 and agreements. Is there any further discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Thank you, CAO. That brings us to a statutory public meeting with a motion moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council move into statutory public meeting March 20th, 2023 at 6:52 p.m. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Municipality takes steps beyond the requirements of the Planning Act to engage the community in land use planning initiatives, including requiring developers to host information sessions in advance of providing the municipality a completed application. The municipality also holds a statutory public meeting on the planning application in order to capture comments and concerns from the public. Council will then receive a staff report with a recommendation on which council will make a decision. After council has made our decision, any person or public body may appeal council's decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal, as long as they have made an oral submission at the statutory public meeting where the planning matter was heard, or provided comments in writing to the clerk's office before or during the statutory public meeting where the planning matter was heard, and requested notice of the decision from the clerk's office. This is also true of any person or public body that wishes to participate in the appeal. For details or information on appealing decisions of council, please visit the municipal website or contact the clerk's office. The item in tonight's statutory public meeting is from the applicant A. Wallace Limited. The location is 114B Ontario Street. The purpose of tonight's public meeting is to address requirements under the Planning Act for hosting a public meeting before council makes a decision, and to obtain public input toward making any decision on the proposed official plan and zoning bylaw amendments and draft plan of subdivision application. The file numbers are sub 2022-02, OPA 04 2022, and Z16 2022. Mr. Warren, by what method and on what date was notice of the applications given?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Notice of the statutory public meeting was provided through the regular advertisement in the Brighton Independent on February the 23rd of this year. Additionally, the public notice sign was posted on the subject lands. Notice of the public meeting was mailed to all landowners within 120 meters of the subject lands. And the applications were also circulated to all agencies under the Planning Act.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. Would you please explain the purpose and reason for the subject applications before council this evening?
Absolutely. Without stealing any of the thunder from the proponent's consultant, who has a brief presentation. The purpose of the draft plan of subdivision is to develop the lands with a residential plan of subdivision containing a combination of single detached, semi-detached, and multiple unit dwellings. There's a total of 73 units are proposed. The official plan amendment is basically to change the designation of the subject lands in order to implement the specific plan of subdivision. And the zoning bylaw, the purpose is basically to establish the appropriate zones for the proposed uses, as well as establish performance standards for these various residential zones. The Municipality of Brighton zoning bylaw currently has the lands as future development, the FD zone, which basically is intended to preserve land for urban development and servicing when a proposal comes forward for the lands, which is what we have now.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. And before I ask if there is anyone present or ask the presenter to come forward, it's not the intent of staff to ask for a council decision this evening, except to receive the information and have staff circle back with the developer for a future decision of council. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I do ask if there's persons present who have questions or comments, I know there's a presentation from the representative. I think it's appropriate to hear your presentation so that everyone who may have questions has more fulsome information from you.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation, which I believe the clerk was going to hopefully man the deck for me here. So just way introductions. My name is Mark Tao. I'm a registered professional planner with Arcadis IBI Group. So IBI Group is one of the planners providing services for the owner and providing these applications to the municipality. So next slide, please. So as is noted, the subject lands are located at 114B Ontario Street. So it's on the west side of Ontario Street, south of the CN main lines, and immediately north of the Brighton Meadows subdivision, which was approved last year by council. The lands are approximately 12 acres in size. Next slide, please. So 5 hectares, 12 acres. They don't actually front directly on Ontario Street. There's a small portion of a municipal right of way that technically still gets addresses Ontario Street, but it's a bit of a road stub that came to the west a number of years ago. So the property has frontage on the public road, about 20 meters. It's currently used primarily for resident or for agricultural uses, but there is a house on the west or on the east side of the property as well as a couple of accessory structures. So next slide, please. So the proposal, as was noted earlier, is for a 73 unit residential subdivision. It's a mix of single detached, semi-detached, and 6 unit buildings. There is a creek that runs through the eastern portion of the site, north-south, and the majority of the development is going to be on the west side of that creek. And next slide, please. So here's just air photo showing property boundaries. So the purple block in the middle is the existing municipal road allowance. And then the property is outlined in red. So there's a existing dwelling and a large garage on the north side. And the intention is that the garage would remain in the house. Existing would either be relocated to be close to the garage and be at its own detached lot or own single attached dwelling lot, or that the existing dwelling be demolished and a new dwelling constructed on the lot associated with the garage. Next slide, please. So this is a view looking from Ontario Street westward into the site. So that what looks like a driveway is actually maintained municipal road. And so the intention would be that that would be upgraded to a full municipal road allowance as part of the access to the site and potentially providing access to future development lands to the west. That would be accessed through the subdivision. Next slide, please. So this just shows the dwellings to the north and south of the access road. So along Ontario Street, that stretch is primarily residential single attached dwellings for the most part. And so there'll be a new or an upgraded road that would go between those 2 dwellings. Next slide, please. So this is the broader development lands. As you can see on the west side, the left-hand side is the majority of where the development would be. And it's 2 new public roads, a mixture, as I said, of singles, semis, and 6 unit dwellings. The creek that traverses the property north-south would be maintained with appropriate setbacks there too, outside of floodplain and any other hazards associated with the creek. On the east side, I said in the southeast corner, the single detached house that exists will be hopefully relocated there or reconstructed in that area of the lot. And then in the southeast corner, there is proposal for in a large block there to be 2 6-unit quasi apartment buildings, I'll call them, but 6-unit buildings with surface parking lots and large landscaped open space. There's also potential future connection to the south. If council may recall, for those of you who were on council, when Brighton Meadows was approved, there was a block on the north edge of that subdivision that was identified as future development. So that driveway, a private road connection, could connect to that future development block. That was part of the Brighton Meadows subdivision application, but it's not needed for this subdivision. It's not necessarily required for access. One of the servicing options would potentially see a sanitary connection that goes south through the subdivision lands to the south, but it's not, again, not required to adequately service the lands. It's just one of the options. Next slide, please. So I should have gone to the next slide. It would have been a little easier to read, but we'll just skip on to that. West side, again, just a mixture of singles and semis, nothing, and 2 6-unit blocks. So nothing particularly remarkable about those. So overall, the mix is a fairly even split between the 3 different housing types, singles, semis, and 6 units. The intention was to provide, particularly with the 6-unit dwellings, to provide a bit more of affordable housing option. They could be rentals. I think there is an opportunity for partnership potentially with the county in terms of affordable housing units in there. But the developer wanted to provide kind of a non-single semi-town option that could be more conducive to more of an entry-level housing option for people, whether it's rentals or owner-occupied. There's no park block proposed at this time. As part of the open house that happened before applications are filed, there was discussion and I think an expression of desire from staff to consider a park space in there. I don't think that's necessarily off the table. I think from our perspective, the park block in this size of a subdivision would be rather small. And so it really pointed to whether or not the municipality wanted smaller park blocks, which typically are more require a lot of maintenance because you're traveling. If you have a lot of park blocks in municipality, it means a lot of travel between subdivisions, smaller parks to maintain a lot of smaller spaces versus maybe larger spaces that are more consolidated. So that was the rationale for not necessarily providing a dedicated park space here. But I think that's something that we work through as part of the comment cycle and comments that we'll receive from staff and the public and council as we go forward. Next slide, please. So a number of studies were completed in support of the applications, including traffic study, looking at the impacts of the development on Ontario Street, the local road connections. No upgrades were identified as being required to accommodate the 73 units, both from either servicing or traffic standpoint. Environmental impact study was completed as well that looks specifically at there's a number of wetlands in the area as well as the creek itself. And so the development was designed with the recommendations of those reports in mind. And next slide, please. So as I said, there was a public consultation process, including an open house in May 2022, where we presented 4 different iterations of the potential development concept. Out of that process, we ended up with a greater density on the site, a greater mix of housing types, and an additional road connection, particularly to the north. There was expression of desire to provide a road connection to the south as well. And that's something I expect that we will talk about with staff as we go through the review process. There are some challenges with connections to the south because there are woodlands, wetlands, et cetera, to the south. And so there's potentially limited benefit of a road connection to the south in this area of the subdivision. I think as lands potentially develop further west, another southerly connection might make more sense or might be providing more direct access to developable lands. But again, that's something I expect will go through with staff as we review comments. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'll move through the next slides fairly quickly. So there's the provincial policy statement obviously applies, as says the in the next slide, the growth plan. So in reviewing the applications, we assess them against the PPS, and then in the next slide, again, the growth plan, and then also the County of Northumberland official plan in the next slide. And the applications are consistent with PPS and the growth plan. The lands proposed to be developed are within the County of Northumberland OP's urban area designation. There are lands, the broader property is actually, this is about half the lands. There is a parcel associated with the same property that's to the west, that's outside of the urban boundary. So we're proposing this time just to develop lands within the boundary. So it does conform to the county OP as well in terms of being eligible for development. So next slide, please. And I'll skip to the next slide. So getting into the municipality's official plan. So an official plan amendment is needed here primarily because it's technically within the greenfield designation. It does fall within the urban settlement boundary, so it is eligible for development, but it's essentially been in reserve as a greenfield property. So in order to allow it to be developed for residential, it does need to be redesignated to residential. There are also policies associated with the environmental features on the land, including wetlands, the creek, wooded areas, et cetera. And so the applications would redefine the boundaries of those. There is some inaccuracies in the existing mapping, showing, for example, water course where the one doesn't exist on the lands. So some of that's just correcting the mapping based on the site-specific studies that specifically assessed where the extent of these features were, including the creek and wetlands. And next slide, please. So this just shows the existing Schedule A. The light green is the greenfield designation. And then there is both on Schedule A and B, identification of some of the environmental features. So the applications would redesignate some of those lands to reflect, again, existing features more precisely, and then leaving the remainder of the lands available for development for residential. Next slide, please. So overall, we reviewed the applications against the official plan, and as proposed to be amended, it does conform with the OP. It's within an area intended for development. It makes use of existing services. It contributes to achieving intensification targets, including providing a variety of housing types beyond the more traditional singles and semi-detached dwellings that Brighton has typically seen in greenfield subdivisions. It respects and provides adequate protection for existing natural heritage features, and overall does, as I said, meet the intent of the official plan and conform to the policies. And next slide, please. So the zoning bylaw is largely reflective of the existing OP, our official plan mapping and zoning. So where the official plan identifies greenfield lands, the zoning is called them future development lands. So it's the same idea where it's essentially placed them in a bit of a holding zone until a development proposal comes forth. There's also, you'll see what looks to be a creek in the middle of the lands, and that creek doesn't actually exist. And so the zoning would rezone the majority of the lands outside the kind of hash marked area, which identifies where the existing creek and floodplain is. So the majority of the lands outside of those areas we rezoned to site-specific residential zones to allow singles and semis under the residential 2 exception zone, or the 6-unit dwellings in the residential 4 exception zones. The next slide, please. So the next several slides are really just a zoning table. So for the 2 different uses, so there is some relief being sought for certain provisions just to reflect the lot fabric that's proposed. So it's mostly adjustments to minimum setbacks, some of it just to reflect the nature of the R4 zone, which is, you know, when it talks about an apartment dwelling, we probably think of more a traditional apartment building, but we're applying it here to a 6-unit dwelling. So some of the provisions that would apply to a large apartment building don't necessarily make sense to a smaller 6-unit building. So we're just maybe making it proportional to what a 6-unit dwelling might require in terms of setbacks, for example. So we'll, in my experience, we'll go through these zone provisions with staff, consider what provisions are being requested, if there's any adjustments that need to be made. But overall, the built form that you would see as a result of the subdivision and the rezoning is pretty consistent with the other subdivisions that have been approved in Brighton in terms of lot sizes, setbacks, et cetera. So we try to be consistent with the character of those existing and approved subdivisions. So we'll just skip through, I think, the next several slides. If there's questions about zoning specifics, we can come back to them. But in the interest of time and keeping everybody awake, I'll just cut right to the chase and conclude that in our opinion, the applications are consistent with the PPS, conform to the growth plan and the county official plan, and conform to the municipality's official plan as proposed to be amended, and overall constitutes good planning, is in the public interest. So the next steps for us is we will hope to receive staff and agency comments, and then we'll work through those comments and come back with a revised proposal that hopefully satisfies all the questions, comments, concerns that have been received, and then move forward from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tao. We'll open the floor to members of the public who have questions or comments, and then we'll open the floor to members of council for the same purpose. So are there persons present who have questions or comments with regard to this proposal? Sir? Please come to the microphone. We are recorded, and anyone joining us on Zoom can't hear you unless you speak into the microphone. Yeah.
Good evening, Your Worship and councillors. My name is John Yarian. I live adjacent to the proposed plan, and I don't have any problem with the plan per se, so this may not be relevant, but I'm interested in the amount of traffic on Ontario Street. This plan, if it's approved, along with Brighton Meadows, which has been approved, is going to add a lot of vehicles to the highway to Ontario Street. And I was just wondering what sort of a study has been carried out on Ontario Street to support this.
So council, we haven't passed the budget yet, but embedded in the budget, if it does pass, is a transportation master plan that will include many parts of the municipality, but Ontario Street was the original focus. With the original reason we came up with the want for that transportation master plan, because we do recognize the impacts of Ontario Street from existing developments, but also from the proposed developments along that stretch.
It's getting pretty busy down there.
Yes, it is.
I have to say, trying to pull it onto that road on a Saturday morning in the summertime is getting pretty exciting these days.
The clerk's asking you to spell your last name, Mr.
I'm
Yarian.
sorry, my last name.
Clerk's here.
It's sorry. It's Yarian, Y-A-R-R-I-E-N. And I'm at 122 Ontario.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else present with questions or comments? Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Brenda Richardson. I live at 104 Raglan Street. I'm asking that in the agreement for this subdivision, I would like to see a designated truck route for all trucks. This has been brought up at previous open meetings and statutory meetings, and our previous manager of site approvals, Josh Berry, and some members of council, previous council, agreed on this. As you all are aware, concrete trucks and most trucks hauling loads of fill will be coming from Trenton and down Highway 64. There's no need for them to come down finished subdivisions on Harbor Street or Raglan. These trucks are destroying our streets and is a safety issue. I suggest that the route, the suggested route would be from Highway 64 onto Butler Street via Prince Edward Street. That's what was discussed with Josh Berry, our previous site approval manager. And it's also a safety issue. So I'm hoping that many of you will consider that. And I know many councillors follow the Brighton, Ontario residents Facebook page and have read all about the complaints about traffic on Raglan, Harbour and Ontario Street, plus numerous communications to staff and council regarding this. We should not have to wait for the traffic study as it will be too late. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Richardson. Any other questions or comments from members of the public? Madam Clerk, there's no one on Zoom. It's just Mr. Whiteman and Councillor Fredis. Members of council, questions or comments with regard to the proposal? Councillor Wheeldon?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, regarding traffic, I see that there's sidewalks throughout the neighborhood, which is good. I imagine we would put a crosswalk in? I guess that's a question for Mr. Warren or Mr. Walsh. Because the main pedestrian throughway is on the east side of Ontario Street, correct?
Yes, the sidewalk is on the east side. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Warren?
Through the chair, sounds good to me. I don't know exactly where that is, but if there's a need to move students from one side to the other, yes, a crosswalk would be completely appropriate.
But I had a question specific to some of the documents that were submitted. I'd love to see that there was an arborist report there. Are tree protection zones enforced at any point by municipal staff? There's a recommendation in the report for tree protection zones. Does anyone ever follow up on that?
Well, through the chair, we don't specifically look at tree protection zones. We would have them fenced off, and we would have to follow, or rather developer would have to follow what was provided in the support document. So if they were to go against that, then they would be sort of taking away from what they were proposing in the first place, right?
I understand that. I guess I was just wondering if there's any follow-up or enforcement of that. It's one thing to have a plan, it's another to follow it.
I'm not aware of any tree enforcement people who work for the municipality.
So the CBO wouldn't do that.
The
No.
chief building official?
No.
No.
Okay, I didn't think so. I was just checking.
Director?
I just add to that, I think there can always be provisions. Commonly, the recommendations of the supporting documents, such as a tree preservation or tree conservation report, would follow through, as Mr. Warren has identified, through the subdivision agreement, through the conclusions there. So there would be a binding arrangement there. And oftentimes there is a maintenance aspect or obligation until it's well established and sustaining itself. That's having, for example, landscape maintenance provisions is a common thing within the subdivision agreement. And if there are any particular areas that need to be particularly protected, it's not uncommon to zone such areas.
And don't mean to put words in Councillor Wheeldon's mouth, but I think the question is if there is damage to trees or tree removal in a protected area, how do we identify that? Who identifies that, and what are the repercussions?
Often in the subdivision agreement, there are securities for such things.
And we have the ability to identify that?
Well, we would have the proponent report back to us. So their qualified person would be reporting back to us. The most risk, of course, is during the construction phases. So once that phase is built out, or the abutting lands are built out and occupied, then the developer would be reporting back to say how that the tree preservation program has been successfully implemented, and then in which case it would begin to ask for the release of securities that have been attached to that task in the subdivision agreement.
Sometimes trees get removed and for various reasons, and we just want to make sure, I think, if I'm again not trying to put words in Councillor Wheeldon's mouth, but if this is a protected zone or a protected area for trees, I think it's Councillor Wheeldon's wish, and maybe all of council's wish, that in fact be true, that this is a protected area for trees. And we wouldn't want to see this developer or any other developer remove trees unnecessarily.
Yes, in the interest of long-term management of standing trees, staff would have to give that some additional thought.
Thank you for that. Councillor Butwell.
To Director Walsh, to you, Mr. Mayor. Director, what kind of holdback are we talking about here, or securities? What would the dollar amount be? Is it a per tree? Is it an overall?
Oftentimes it's on a per tree basis. So 20 trees at so much per tree, plus cost of the planting, make sure that the right root ball and material has been deposited within that root ball, et cetera. So there's a landscape diagram of a typical planting. And, the cost of work schedule will say, 20 trees, it might be 10 of this kind of tree and 5 of this kind of shrub, et cetera, for a total.
As a quick follow-up, I guess I'm gonna just be more clear. If there's a tree that's not supposed to be removed, damaged, what is the cost of doing so? What kind of securities are we talking about? What kind of deposit or holdback?
So the security holdback is 50% of the total cost of works. And so our staff would follow up to typically to see if there's any deficiencies in terms of the designed work, planned work. And if there are deficiencies, then the securities aren't released until the deficiencies are rectified. And once everything's installed as per design, then the request for release of securities comes to staff. And if there are no deficiencies and everything's in order as per the plan design, then they are released. And there's sometimes a further 15% holdback for maintenance periods. So if something's been planned, looks great, okay, let's have a few more months or a year and make sure that it's still alive.
So in the instance where there is a tree, say a 40-year-old chestnut tree that's not supposed to be touched, if it just gets bulldozed accidentally, is there a specific figure that is assigned to existing trees that are supposed to be protected in this protection zone? Not additional trees that are planted, but what kind of security do they provide up front for those types of plantings, old plantings?
Yeah, there's usually not a premium assigned for ensuring there's no damage to existing trees, but what's becoming more common is something that's really unrelated to the question, I guess, but indirectly related, is the ecological offsetting. If someone's going to be approved for removing significant woodlot, then they need to compensate that elsewhere at a certain rate. And there are some best practices, 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio for what you take out, where you compensate another location, preferably within the same ecological land classification somewhere. So we in fact did do that for the subdivision to the south, Brighton Meadows. So there was an area of significant woodlot identified in its background study, and it was agreed or accepted that a certain edge of it, a little finger actually protruded in along a fence line, more or less, or a cultural meadow. And it was agreed that was, for a number of reasons, probably not going to be the best thing to actually preserve. So anyway, so it was practical to remove that and have it compensated elsewhere, and there would be an overall net benefit. And so that was the approach taken. So going back to the original question about something that's maybe zoned and agreed to be protected, and then, oops, it's not, then there needs to be compensation for that. It's not normally itemized and a value assigned, but the study will have taken into account the value of what's been inventoried, and not, not financially, but here's a nice tree, this is to be preserved or whatever. And then if it's not, then we go back to a qualified person and say, okay, how's compensation going to happen here?
Is that something that we as a council can discuss perhaps at some point? Having that be a part of the discussions on how a community will look, that if there are tree protection zones, that we assign a dollar value to that, and if there's damage in there, that they forfeit that money completely, or a portion of, or assign it. Is that something that we can look at?
Director Walsh?
Through the mayor, I think with ecological offsetting getting more interest, Simcoe Conservation Authority in particular is a leader in that area. And with recent discussions, you heard CEO Bateman talking about how the regulations are being reviewed and maybe changing here. They're also taking a look at changes to the Ontario Water Resources Manual and other related documents, all in preparation for acknowledging more ecological offsetting, perhaps looking at urban areas where it's preferred that we have housing, except for the core features, and maybe some of the more marginal features and functions that they be compensated for in a non-developable area, or in a rural area, for example, so that there is an overall net benefit in time, because now you're doubling or tripling the ecological footprint, maybe not right away, but through plantings in time, it would amount to that. Because especially in urban areas, a lot of it is kind of areas that have been heavily impacted, and they're early succession species, meaning they were farmed areas just 40 or 50 years ago, and that sounds like a long time, but ecologically not. And so you're having first succession species like poplar and invasive, non-native invasive species, etc. So as you read this EIS, typically that's what you're finding. If what's not a field has been previously hard impact areas, and there might be one area that's off-site, in fact, to the south, that has any kind of significance in terms of mature deciduous trees, for example. But on this site, in areas that would not otherwise be zoned EP, probably there's not much significance there, which is not surprising given its location. But how we protect areas that we want to see perhaps move beyond the early succession stages of ecological evolution and growth, then we'll have to be mindful of that and have maybe a program safeguarding that. And as Mr. Warren indicated, like fencing will be important in some areas, especially if it's accessible to the public. The more public entry, the more impacts, right? Or risk of fire, etc. So
I wonder if there's an opportunity to have a broader discussion on land use planning policies in the municipality at some point in the future, including this, and we'll circle back to this application specifically now. But I know we're going to be talking about administrative policies coming up. We're going to be talking about our procedure bylaw. I wonder if after we tackle those things, we could then, and I'll look to you to remind me that the next step in that policy review will be land use planning policies, and we'll chat with our planning team about that. Fair enough.
Yep. Thank you very much for your patience with me.
Any other question? Oh, Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Mayor. I have two questions. Wondering if staff is satisfied with the justification that there will be no green space, that it's a small area. We've heard a lot of commentary over the last months, not only around this table, but from the general public, that regardless of the size of any development, green space should be there. So I'm wondering if that is something that the developer is still willing to maybe adjust in that project. My other question,
Mr. Warren, we'll get you to tackle that question
All right.
first.
Sure. Through the chair, the green space that's provided is primarily associated with the water course at the eastern edge of it, rather than add some like a programmed parquet or tot lot or whatever it would be through there, which is not as desirable, it seems, from a public works perspective very often for maintenance. So that there is green space that's provided there, but it's more the naturalized green space and appropriate buffers from that, rather than, at least that's what's been provided. If that answers.
so it's basically just a freebie that we're getting anyway. Like, to me, it's just excess land, and that, well, there you go. And we've seen that already in a couple of developments, right? It's just, well, they can't develop that, so they'll justify that as green space or park space, which is,
Well, it's not taken as parkland dedication, though. We take the cash for that.
Right.
So they
And we've-
provide us with the land and they provide us with the cash to add to.
Right, and
Yeah.
we've had those discussions as well. It isn't always about the money. But that's okay. If staff's, I'm not the developer, I'm not the planner here. Second question,
It is a council decision at the end of the day.
right.
Carry on. Next question.
So second question, and I know that at some point in the future, the development could be expanded. I see only one entrance egress from Ontario Street into this development. I know we've had talks, there again, discussions regarding fire and ambulance service going in these places. Staff satisfied that there's enough space for those who, if there happened to be a fire in the middle of this development, will everybody be able to get out safely around whatever equipment would be in there?
Mr. Warren?
Through the chair, it's one of the things that we're still looking at, to be honest with you, is additional points of access potentially from the south. Thank you.
Councillor Wheeldon?
Thank you. Along all of those same lines, on both of those questions, circling back to cash in lieu of parkland, how much cash are we talking about in something this size?
Mr. Warren?
Through the chair, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. It's 5% is generally what the Planning Act allows for.
That's 5% of the space that should be set aside for parkland, and then it's valued on
Could
a-
be set aside for parkland, yeah,
Yeah.
and it's the value of that land, yeah.
I'm under the impression that it would work out to maybe a few $1,000s. Is that generally the case?
I haven't looked at the figures, to be honest with you.
That's
I would have no
okay.
idea off the top of my head.
I don't want to put you on the spot. The next thought I had about that is seeing that in the drawings, there are potential roads to the north and west. I'm assuming that there will be an additional development at some point in the future. Would it be appropriate to, recognizing that this is a small neighborhood, say, well, then this 5% should be attached to the next phase to have a more substantial park required there? Assuming, of course, that the same developer is going to continue.
Through the chair, that's one of the things that we would look at through the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Absolutely, which is soon to arrive, I understand.
Yes. I'm under the impression from what I've seen of that so far that we are already quite deficient in our parkland. So I'm not a fan of having cash in lieu of when the cash is much less rare than parkland in our town, I think. The other question I had, if I may continue, Mr. Mayor. How many of these homes will be built to accessibility standards? I know that there's no requirement that a certain amount of homes be built to accessibility standards. Working in the real estate industry, I know that very, very few homes are built to accessibility standards. I know some in Brighton are built level entry with wide doorways and things like that. Is there any goal for that here?
Through the chair, I'm not aware of any such goal. If it's not required under the building code, I don't believe there's a requirement for any draft plan of subdivision to have accessible units at this time
Given
under the
the,
current legislation. Yeah.
thank you. Given the reputation Brighton has as a retirement community, might it behoove us to make such a suggestion to developments moving forward?
Might be a good topic of discussion when we circle back to land use planning policies.
Absolutely, yeah. I just wanted to make that comment. I have a few more, if that's all right.
I don't see anyone jumping, so go ahead.
Okay. Is there any requirement for a construction management plan regarding how current residents might be impacted by construction? I've received several complaints recently from the Rabbit Run neighborhood regarding things like the fact that their garbage and recycling is not picked up at the curb. They have to walk it out to the edge of the road because there are construction vehicles blocking the roads, and the county staff won't come into the neighborhood lest they crash their garbage trucks into construction vehicles. Is there any kind of consideration for, as this neighborhood is under development, it's going to impact the neighbors around it?
Through the chair, yes, there are provisions for that exact type of thing in subdivision agreements, which include having too much soil piled in any one particular spot, making sure that streets are cleaned at certain times, generally following a Friday of construction, making sure that somebody gets out there and they use the proper mud mats and roads are properly cleaned prior to the weekend. But there are a number of those types of things in subdivision agreements.
Given that the complaints I've been receiving about a different neighborhood are related to the same developer, I would encourage us to make sure that we require something in thought regarding that. With regard to affordability, very glad to hear that there was mention of talking to the county. That was in my notes of things to ask for, so thank you for that. Are we able to insist on that?
Mr. Warren?
Through the chair, are we able to insist that we talk to the county?
No, I think the question is, are we able to insist that the developer engage with the county with regard to affordable housing in the development? And I think at the end of the day, what we'd be doing would be asking our staff to include in a subdivision agreement that a certain amount be sold to the county for that purpose. I don't think we can hamstring the county.
No.
We can only ask that the developer ensure that they're engaging with the county for that purpose.
That sounds reasonable to me.
Wonderful. And my last question was regarding the floodplain map in the presentation. Seemed to cross over the southeast corner of the southeast corner lots in the western portion of the plan. I know that some of the setbacks are requested to be reduced. I don't know if this is just a matter of scale of mapping or what, but when I look at where the floodplain seems to be indicated, it looks like the southeast corner lots couldn't be there at all.
It's certainly something we would look into, as luckily, too bad Rhonda's gone, but the Conservation Authority has been reviewing this plan already in regards to the floodplain and the flood prone areas, as well as the crossing of the creek itself.
Yeah.
And how that will actually happen. So that will probably be part of the report we get back from them.
Many thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Paredes.
To the chair, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. To the chair and Mr. Warren, and I guess to follow up on Councillor Wilden's comment, my understanding is Bill 109, which received royal assent last April, raised those parkland requirements. Anything under 5 hectares went from 5% to 10%, and anything over 5 hectares went from 10 to 15%, which, as I recall, when we spoke to a gentleman in an earlier session, gave us 2 opportunities, either to significantly increase the cash in lieu, or alternatively, as Councillor Wilden and I have discussed, recognizes that it makes parkland set aside for young families and stuff a more valuable resource or commodity. And I guess my question is, will we review this application in light of those parkland set asides contained in Bill 109?
Mr. Warren.
Thank
Through
you.
the chair, absolutely. If it's new legislation, we don't have a choice.
Any other questions from members of, thank you. Anything further, Councillor Paredes? Thank you. Councillor Wright.
I just had a couple questions on the 6-unit buildings. Do we know what the square footage of these units are and what the number of bedrooms would be in them?
might be a question better for the proponent if they wish to speak on the matter. I don't know personally, no.
Mr. Towers, did you hear the question?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. There was a number of questions. I'm able to respond to some of them. I can respond to them, that one specifically now, or there's others I could speak to as well.
Do me a favor, respond to that one.
Sure.
We'll ask some more. And there's a resident who has a question who's joined us by Zoom. We'll get that question and then maybe you can respond at the end. And then we'll open the floor back up just to make sure we've captured everybody's comments.
All right, so thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So I don't think we have a specific floor area per unit, but my understanding is that they are intended to be 1 and 2 bedroom units, not necessarily large units, in line with making them affordable and accessible to probably a housing type that isn't commonly available as a new product, particularly in Brighton. So I think it is kind of that smaller, maybe up to 1,000 square feet ish per unit within those 6. So total 6,000-ish square feet for the whole building, 1 to 2 bedrooms per.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Wright, anything further?
No, I'm
Thank
good.
you. Deputy Mayor?
I'd like to thank my colleagues for great questions. You've been lining them up the way I had them here. Question though to that gentleman again, Roy, he doesn't need to come back to the table. The 6 units, I think it's great that we'd be looking at some rental units. We definitely need them. And the size sounds reasonable to me. That makes them more affordable, presumably. Have you, I guess the question when you come back to the table, have you negotiated or discussed that with the county on a deep discussion with if they're going to be the management and be the leasers or whatever the term is, landlords? Have you made that come into a discussion on, you mentioned selling the land to or providing the land to the county and let the county manage it? Have those discussions been made and how close are we? Because when you come back to the table for me to make a good vote on this in favor, I'll be looking for that. I think that's exactly what we need. And I know you were leaning that way too, Councillor, right? So, and the size is really, if they're luxury apartments, I'm not interested, but they need to be good quality, affordable. Yes. And you used the word accessibility. You said, well, you asked the question and I just heard it a minute ago. So that might be something that would be considered in that type of rental units as well. So, I mean, I'm sure part of it will have to be probably. I would just have one other question. You were talking about the parks, and I'm glad you were, Jeff. Something that's always on all our minds is to get more. We're talking parkland, not just a green space. Green space can be widened, road allowances and things like that. We're talking places for kids to go and or parents and people that can enjoy the outdoors. There was talk with the subdivision, but on the south side of that, and I believe there was a trail that was going to go all the way up the west side of that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that there was talk of trail going all the way up. Is there a wood line at the back of that? I believe, and before you get to the next property, which could be the same property owned by the owner, but that is it's out of the building, out of the development area. But I believe we did talk about this trail that would go all the way up to.
So if you go to one of the slides, it would appear that there are sidewalk entryways into the environmentally protected zone. And it looks like those sidewalks are intended to connect to the development to the south, which would likely include, and I don't know this for a fact, but would likely include any trail system that the southern developer is including as well. But I will wait for the developer's planner to come back and maybe they can enlighten us with more details on those sidewalks that we're seeing in the slide.
I'm glad you brought up the sidewalk. So that's why I brought it up. I just want to hear those things. It might fall into place a little bit with what we've been asking tonight. So that's basically what I've got after some good questions here. Oh, go ahead.
You have another question? Can I, if you're okay, I'm going to go to the citizen. Mr. Burkle, you've been very patient waiting for us, and I'll get you to ask your question or make your comment, sir. Perhaps Ron fell asleep. Ron Burkle.
Yeah, I don't have any comments.
Oh, okay. You're just
Oh.
listening.
My problem is I just joined because I didn't get the notification
Yeah,
until a
we
few minutes
heard,
ago.
and the clerk apologizes for that.
So I don't have any comments because I don't know what to comment on. So I'll wait till I see some of the paperwork.
Okay, so we'll ask our planning staff to be in touch with the clerk's office to provide Mr. Burkle with some, or find out what details he's looking for. Thank you, Mr. Burkle. Councilor Butwell.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I've heard a couple of people make reference to, developments connecting to the north, potentially down the road, have something to the west. There's going to be something to the south at some point, same developer, who knows? But I am hesitant to rely on somebody's future commitment when it comes to parkland. For no other reason than who knows what world we're going to be living in 5-10 years down the road. If there's the desire to push it off to the future, I'd rather take all of it on in the first phase and get it all over and done with. And therefore we don't have to continue addressing this and pushing it down the road.
Thank you. Anything further from members of council? Anything further from the public? I have a bit of a diatribe myself before we head on. I'm hearing from members of council that access to the north and the south would be desirable for this subdivision. So it looks like the design currently has access to the northern unproposed space, but not to the southern proposed space. And I'm hearing from members of council that access north and south would be desirable, roadway access north and south. And we'll get the developer's planner to speak to us about access to the trail system as well. Are secondary units being considered for this proposal, Mr. Warren?
Through the chair, I haven't seen any specific zoning provisions that are, lend itself to them. However, they are of course permitted in all residential zones.
It would be my preference, and don't know what the rest of council thinks about this, but as we have done in the southern neighbor, to insist on at least 10% of houses being purpose-built secondary units minimum. And I think there's a market for them anyway, but that doesn't mean anything if we don't build them. I'm going to reiterate the parkland thing that we're hearing. It was good policy 25 years ago. I think it was great policy, good idea to collect money so we can buy a larger park. I think it made a lot of sense when we didn't have a clue that we would have this many subdivisions coming online. But today we live in a different world, and we're seeing families, not just that, but the world we lived in 25 years ago. We were attracting younger seniors out of the city. They weren't looking for playground space. They were looking for Brighton by the Bay amenity type space, and so they weren't looking for the kind of playground space I think we need in Brighton today. So I'm getting the sense that when we do talk land use planning policies, we're going to have to talk about what that looks like from a parkland dedication perspective. But for this development and moving forward anecdotally, I'm hearing that council would like to see amenity space. And council, we recognize that means future budget crunching, that's going to cost operationally. And I think the people understand that every time you plop up a new playground, it's going to cost, X number of dollars to run a lawnmower from wherever the lawnmower is now to the new spot. So I'm getting the sense that we're wanting to provide those services to the community, and we're asking developers to ensure that those services are available to the neighborhoods. Touched on that. So the only question I would get the developer's planner to answer is The 6-unit quasi apartment buildings. That's your quote, sir. So I'm just hoping you can give us a little more detail about what you mean by a quasi apartment building. And I think you've probably heard the comments about affordability concerns and ensuring not just market affordability, but actual affordability through housing assistance as required. You mentioned you were endeavoring to engage with the county. Happy to help out in that endeavor if you need to. But it's important for our community to have those purpose-built affordable housing units in this subdivision. So last chance, members of council, before I call the developer's planner back over to Councillor
Okay.
Rowley.
Thank you. And this isn't a question for the developer, but just to kind of clarify, we spoke about land use planning. Is that something that we could also discuss when within the next months we'll be reviewing our official plan so that we have it right in there? As far as parkland, I'm speaking parkland, green space. Is that something that
mean
would fall into that as well?
For when we talk parkland dedication things?
Yeah.
I don't know if that is that official planning policy?
It can be, Mayor. Typically might be more in a secondary plan.
Right.
It's nice that the master parks and recreation plan is being done as Manager Warren has alluded to, and that will very nicely inform the secondary plan or official plan in a more broader sense.
Thank you. But we will be discussing land use planning policy, and we can include a policy document around what our expectations are for future developments with regard to parkland dedication in those neighborhoods. Thank you. Councillor Wright. Oh, Councillor Fredis, thank you.
To the chair, thank you. I just wanted to remind my council colleagues of Bill 109 and parkland set aside. Under 5 hectares going from 5% to 10, and anything over 5 hectares going from 10 to 12. And we should be keeping those new numbers in mind. Everything we've looked at up to now has been based on the lesser numbers, and it doesn't reflect Bill 109, which only received royal assent last year. So if we're committed to parkland, I think we owe it to our community to reflect those numbers that are inherent in Bill 109. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fredis. Most importantly, thank you for staying home this evening. Planning team, you're hearing what Councillor Fredis has to say, and I'd be curious to hear your interpretation of Bill 109 and what that means for our community as well at some point. Again, probably at that land use planning discussion, policy discussion when we have it in the future.
You should, definitely, Mayor. Bill 23 was on the back of Bill 109, so there's been a lot of changes to the Planning Act, and the province has targeted the Section 51.1 parkland dedication provisions, and it overlaps into another concept called community benefits, which is a replacement for Section 36, which was the bonus density bonusing, and there is some overlap relationship there. For Brighton, it's really 51.1, not Section 36. So there might be some crossover concepts. We'll have to clarify that in follow-up.
Thank you. I think it would be beneficial to council to hear that clarification. Thank you. Anything further from members of council? Councillor Wright?
I think I'd just like to point out too that if those 6-unit spaces are done and a small family moves into them, they will have 0 backyard to play in. So the parks become a parkette, becomes even all the more important at that point.
Fair comment. Thank you. Members of council, anything further? Members of the public, anything further? Mr. Towes, you probably have a list. Am I saying your name correctly?
Tao, you're pretty
Tao.
close.
Tao, I've added an S.
But yes, yeah, better than most. So it's good. So thank you everyone for your comments and members of the public and council. So I'll try to run through the high points maybe, and then if there's anything I missed, happy to answer those in follow up. I think Mr. Bryan had asked about traffic impacts. So there was a TIS that was done in September 2022. And it looked at things like the current and future traffic conditions and, you know, whether or not turning lanes, for example, were needed for this, even projecting out in the future when traffic might increase, taking into account other approvals of subdivisions, et cetera. And it did find that this particular connection point was adequate and that there weren't any upgrades triggered by this development. But to the broader point about needing or looking at Ontario Street as a whole, it's certainly something that, you know, this is one of many things that have contributed to traffic on Ontario Street. So I think that's that big picture traffic situation on Ontario Street. Questions about the tree protection zones. Oftentimes, just my experience that protecting existing trees are dealt with under tree bylaws. That's probably the most clear-cut way to deal with them. When you are dealing with a subdivision, you do have maybe some additional powers, and there was a tree inventory that was done. Just anecdotally on this site, most of the existing mature trees are within the regulated area associated with the creek. So permits would be required from Lower Trent to do any work in that kind of area around the creek. And so I could say, other than the road crossing, which happily the trees are actually mostly outside of that road crossing area, all those existing mature trees, you know, there wouldn't be any need to disturb them because it's associated with the creek and the floodplain, et cetera. So wouldn't really be needed. There are some along the fringes, but again, some of those are on the existing lot in the northeast where the garage is. And again, no real need to remove trees there. In terms of parkland on site, that's something we did look at, and obviously we heard some feedback. The draft parks design manual that Brighton is working on, we reviewed that, and looking at that, what was identified in there is that smaller parkettes, which would kind of be what would happen in a smaller subdivision like this, are not what the municipality is needing. It wasn't necessarily smaller park spaces, seemingly. It was more larger defined program park spaces that were maybe more what was missing. So I think that was part of what pushed us towards not necessarily having a park here in this subdivision. Related to that, there is intention to have a pedestrian connection to Brighton Meadows to the south. So that's part of what there's a block 21, which connects from the west side down to the south into that woodlot, into the proposed trail system for Brighton Meadows, as well as the laneway on the east side that could provide a pedestrian connection through there as well. Related to the comment about Bill 109, so just to clarify, so that increased parkland dedication amount actually only applies in proximity to a designated transit hub, basically. So it's really a GTA or Toronto centric if you have a transit station. The increase to up to 10% for sites under 5 hectares and up to 15% for sites over 5 hectares. That really is specific to lands in a provincially designated transit hub, essentially. So it was meant to address where you have, because at the same time, the province is allowing super high densities around these transit hubs. So the province wanted to say, okay, if we're going to allow you to have like 1,000 dwelling units per net hectare around these transit hubs, we're going to up the parkland requirement to accommodate enough parkland for these high density hubs. So that part of Bill 109 wouldn't apply in Brighton, unfortunately. But overall, from the parkland perspective, as one of the councillors, as the mayor said, it is up to council to decide about whether you'll accept cash in lieu or whether you want parkland. So certainly something that can come out of this process. So affordable housing, my understanding is that the developer is the one who's kind of been leading the charge in terms of engaging with the county in the affordable housing conversation. So he's not here tonight, so I'll have to follow up with him about where that stands specifically. I don't know that the design of the units hasn't been advanced to say whether they're accessible or not. And I don't know if the developer himself would actually build those 6 units, or if the end buyer of those lots, for example, would be in charge of the design. I suspect that would be the case. Here. Secondary units, as Mr. Warren said, they are permitted in any service urban lot at this point. So I'm not sure if requiring 10% is strictly necessary. I know in Applewood Meadows, that was something that, because we did review for the municipality in Applewood Meadows, and that was something that we had looked at together with staff and recommended. So I'm not sure the uptake on that, but again, that's certainly something that can be considered as well. So in terms of last question about quasi apartment buildings, just that it's a bit of an odd, you don't really see 6-unit buildings all that often. You're either doing single semis in towns, or you're doing maybe stacked townhouses, which are more common these days instead of the old style walk-up apartments. So my understanding of the 6-unit would kind of be, it's almost like back-to-back townhouses. So you have 3 units on one side of the building and then 3 units on the other side of the building potentially. So everybody could have their own independent exit. But again, hasn't really been specifically designed yet, but it's just meant to be a relatively affordable stick built or wood frame building style that is a little bit higher density, but still hopefully fits in with the, like a greenfield subdivision. So it's not too tall, still kind of can maintain like an aesthetic of maybe a townhouse block, so it doesn't look out of place. So I think that's really the intention there. With respect to that, the green space for the 6 units, it was, I believe this councillor made that comment about maybe some of the townhouse blocks not necessarily having a lot of like a private outdoor space. So 2 of the blocks, yes, they will be a bit more constrained in terms of not necessarily having a lot of private yard space. That's on the west side. On the east side, block 16, that's a much larger block, and so there's a lot of green space afforded to those 2 6-unit blocks. But yeah, something to look at for the other 2 on the west side of the creek, that they're a little bit not as much green space for each of the individual units. So I think those are all the ones I had. I can skim through, but if I missed any, happy to answer those.
Thank you, Mr. Tao. You got my list anyway. Councillor Butwell, yeah.
Thank you. Will the 6-unit buildings, will they be single story or 2-story? Do you anticipate?
Yeah, I anticipate 2-story. Yeah. I think it depends on the ultimate footprint, I guess, in terms of fitting on the lot, but I anticipate 2-story. But there's different ways you can do it too. So you could, if you build slab on grade, you could have units at the ground floor that would be accessible, kind of more or less at grade, and then maybe have an upper floor that's a separate unit. So different ways to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Rowley.
Missed the consideration around 2 entrances, exits off Ontario Street. The north and the south, right?
A north and south access to the, for future access. Is that what you're thinking? So we brought it up, but you didn't comment on it, Mr. Tao.
Yeah, so that was one I missed. So on the west side of the creek, I know there was a request, I believe, from a landowner, an adjacent landowner, about making another connection. I think when we looked at the connection to the south on the west side of the creek, when we looked at the environmental impact study that was done, there's a lot of wetland, woodland on that side to the south. And so we weren't sure what we were actually making a connection to there, because it didn't seem like there was much developable land. I don't think having a connection to the south is necessarily off the table. It would have to make sense in terms of connecting to actual developable land versus just being a road step into kind of highly constrained environmental lands. We did, make a connection further to the west, and the thought is that to the west there's probably more developable land if you go north or south, or less constrained land. So there is that opportunity further west to make another connection to the south. But the one block that we have on the east side of the creek does provide an opportunity for a connection further south to the Brighton Meadows future development block. It wasn't intended to be a public street, because it would basically make that one block with the two 6-unit buildings not very developable. It would probably mean losing at least one of those 6-unit buildings. So I think that's something with staff we can explore further about. If there is a proper public road connection to the south, where does it make the most sense to put it? So.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Anything further now from council or the public?
Evening, Council, Mayor. My name is Jeff Darrington. I live at 175 Ontario Street. And I wanted to echo Mr. Yarian's comments around traffic. I've lived in Ontario Street for over 20 years. And from the time my kids were young till they're now 18 and 16, I've seen cars passing buses while kids are crossing the street. I've seen all kinds of things. And to put some perspective on traffic, last year I filed a Freedom of Information request to get records from the speed sign. So I'll let you sit for 5 seconds and think how many vehicles you think went south on Ontario Street from June to August. 91,000. So I'm just bringing perspective to council. Last year, that's when the sign was put in June. And that was to August. That was the time frame I wanted because there's a lot of building, a lot of heavy vehicles. And I know there's builders here. They've got work to do. I don't want to slow it down. But there's a lot going on Ontario Street. I know you've heard it enough, but I don't need a traffic study. I just got my own. And you know what? You kind of have your own as well. You just need a second LED sign at the other end of Ontario Street on the other side of Raglan Street. Once you hit Raglan Street, it's Brighton Speedway. I walk every day, I bike. As soon as people pass Raglan Street, it's a raceway to get to the end of that street, wherever they got to go. I don't know where they're going, but on the weekends, from Friday night to Sunday late afternoon, when people are going home from Toronto because they enjoy Presqu'île like we do, it's a madhouse. People are flying. And there's times when it's vehicles you can't hear, like Teslas and e-bikes and, you know, things that are just so quiet when they come down Ontario Street. You don't know they're there until they're gone, and then swoosh, they go by your driveway. So there's data available to the township. They could have even more data available if they put in a secondary LED sign going north on the other side of Raglan. I had a bit of involvement in this kind of thing in my previous life, as the mayor knows. Bit of a tech whiz myself, so I know what this data is like, and I'd highly suggest it to get your own data. Also to provide the OPP some data, because that's a whole other study. I've been following the news. It's been pretty hot in the paper. There's not a lot of enforcement on Ontario Street, just like the rest of Brighton. Ontario Street's even worse because most of the problems on the weekends are out of towners. And I want to be blatantly honest. They don't care that that sign says 50. I've seen that sign light up and flash red. And I don't know if anybody knows what that means, but sir, you might. It means it's over 99. And I've witnessed it myself because the light turns red and it can't display it because it's a 2-digit LED sign. So there's a big problem on Ontario Street, and there's other problems in town. Ontario Street is really bad. And that's all I want to add, and some data to the mix as well. Okay,
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that, Mr. Darrington. And we're not disputing or arguing that Ontario Street's a problem child, if you will. We just need the actual data, and we need the experts to tell us the best way to do it, right? I get it. I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying, 100%. And I can tell you it's not just out of towners. I drove down Ontario Street today at 50 kilometers an hour, and one of your neighbors, sir, pushed me along Ontario Street like I was pushing a cart and horse. So I almost stopped and got out and said, "What are you doing, man?" But I thought that might be a silly thing to do, so I just kept driving at 50. Anything further? Go ahead, Mrs. Richardson.
I'd just like to add a couple of points to what Mr. Darrington just said. His street is out of towners. My street is locals. You may recall, probably the only one around the table would be Mayor Ostrander. Back in 2009, CN did a study, and in 2009, there were 6,000 cars that crossed those tracks on Prince Edward Street. That was in 2009. Within a year and a half, last year, with the Black Cats on Raglan Street, it was an increase of 3,000 cars a day. There's 10,000 cars a day a year and a half ago that's going down Cedar Street. That is what these developments are doing to south of the tracks. You are putting our kids and everybody at risk. I don't think we need to wait for this traffic study. You can get portable speed humps with bolts, move them around, save some money on these consultants, and start doing things. Paint the crosswalks, buy some of these speed humps, move them around, Move those signs around and save yourselves the money. You know, you don't have to have a rocket scientist to do this. You've been hearing it for 5 years about what's happening south of the tracks. Harbor Street, Cedar Street is a mess. I sent Mr. Whiteman. He is, I'll tell you, he's been good for our town. He's so cooperative with everybody. There was a pothole on 81 Cedar Street. It was this wide and this deep. We have never seen our roads so bad, and that is why I am so for having a truck route designated in these pre-services agreement. If Alice Street can get signs that says no heavy trucks, I think Raglan Street and Cedar Street need them as well.
Thank you.
Just a little extra point.
I got it. I think we all heard it. Thank you. Anything further from members of council or the public? Mr. Warren, any final comments?
None at this time, thank you.
Wise man. We look forward to hearing the report coming back after you've collected and analyzed all these comments and had discussions with the developer. We look forward to seeing what happens next. Motion is moved by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Wright. The staff report of the Planning and Development Department dated March 20th, 2023 be received regarding applications for proposed draft plan of subdivision, official plan amendment, and zoning bylaw amendment regarding a proposed residential development located at 114B Ontario Street, and that after receiving comments from the public, commenting agencies, peer reviewers, and municipal staff, that a staff report is brought back for council's consideration. Is there any discussion? All in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. And a motion moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon, that council move out of the statutory public meeting, March 20th, 2023 at 8:12 p.m. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Brings us to our planning and development reports. Our first report is with regard to the assumption for public use of roads and all related above and below ground municipal infrastructure, Hamilton Woods Phase 2. Mr. Gooding, we've read your report. Do you have anything to add or highlight, sir?
Pardon me, yes, through mayor to council, I also add is just for clarification that the Harbor Point Stormwater Management Facility is not included in the assumption of Hamilton Woods Phase 2 and 3.
Thank you for that. The motion before me is moved by Deputy Mayor Anderson, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon. The council receives a staff report regarding the assumption for public use of roads and all related above and below ground municipal infrastructure for Hamilton Woods Phase 2 subdivision. And further, that council enacts a bylaw to assume for public use the roads and all related above and below ground services, including transportation, water, sanitary, and stormwater infrastructure, specifically identified in Registered Plan 39M 942 Hamilton Woods Phase 2 subdivision. And further, that if required prior to the mayor's signature, the municipal solicitor and the director of planning and development be authorized to make minor revisions to the assumption bylaw as may be necessary to address refinement of attached schedules or to reflect legal descriptions, block numbers, etc. And further, that the municipal solicitor be directed to register the assumption bylaw at the Northumberland County Registry Office and have the authority to revise the bylaw so far as necessary for the purposes of registration. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. Just about missed you, Mr. Gooding. The next report is with regard to Phase 3, Hamilton Woods. Again, assumption for public use. Mr. Gooding, do you have anything to add or highlight?
No, I do not.
Same comment as before?
Correct.
Thank you. Motion is moved by Deputy Mayor Anderson, seconded by Councillor Wright, that council receives the staff report regarding the assumption for public use of roads and all related above and below ground municipal infrastructure for Hamilton Woods Phase 3 subdivision. And further, the council enacts a bylaw to assume for public use the roads and all related above and below ground services, including transportation, water, sanitary, and stormwater infrastructure, specifically identified in Registered Plan 39M 942 Hamilton Woods Phase 3 subdivision. And further, that if required prior to the mayor's signature, the municipal solicitor and the director of planning and development be authorized to make minor revisions to the assumption bylaw as may be necessary to address refinement of attached schedules or to reflect legal descriptions, block numbers, etc. And further, that the municipal solicitor be directed to register the assumption bylaw at the Northumberland County Registry Office and have the authority to revise the bylaw so far as necessary for the purposes of registration. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. And the final staff report is with regard to operational impacts of Bill 23, More Homes Built Faster Act and related provincial initiatives. Mr. Walsh, pardon me, Director Walsh, we've read your report. Do you have anything to add or highlight?
Nothing further, Mayor?
Thank you. The motion is moved by Councillor Wheeldon and seconded by Councillor Rowley that Council receives the staff report dated March 20th, 2023 regarding operational impacts of Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act 2022 and related provincial initiatives, and that municipal staff issue a request for qualifications regarding peer review services for environmental impact studies and stormwater management studies, and that staff review opportunities to realize improved cost recovery through a revised fees and charges bylaw, and that through the Director of Finance and Administration, Watson and Associates Economists Limited, report to Council at the time of a DC background report and bylaw update on details of any adverse financial impacts related to the revisions to the Development Charges Act and related legislation, and that fiscal impact assessment reports and pre-development financing agreements be considered for developments eligible for development charges or parkland dedication exemptions with the municipal pre-consultation bylaw, and complete application requirement bylaws be updated accordingly, and that staff prepare an official plan amendment that will establish policies related to matters to be regarded for minor variance applications, and that the municipal site plan control bylaw and a related manual is recommended to be updated for Council's future consideration, and that staff prepare a parkland dedication bylaw for Council's consideration. Is there any discussion? Councillor Rowley. I was just to see if he had his hand up, but I saw yours.
Thank you. Just 6.3, number 2, is that something that we normally would be dealing with Lower Trent with? Or is that, would that be different?
No, that's correct. That's bang on. That's what we always relied on Lord Trent previously, and by virtue of Bill 23, we no longer can. Yep.
Thank you both. Any other questions or comments from members of council? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. Brings us to items for information purposes, of which there are none. Brings us to unfinished business, of which there is none noted on this agenda. That brings us to bylaws. The first bylaw is with regard to the assumption of public use of roads, etc. for Hamilton Woods Phase 2, moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon, that council gives a bylaw its first, second, and third reading and finally passes on this date. Being a bylaw to assume the roadways and certain public works on Plan 39M 929, being the Phase 2 Hamilton Woods subdivision in the Municipality of Brighton. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. And the second and final bylaw is with regard to Phase 3 Hamilton Woods assumption for public use, etc. Moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon. That council gives a bylaw its first, second, and third reading and finally passes on this date. Being a bylaw to assume the roadways and certain public works on Plan 39M 942, being the Phase 3 Hamilton Woods subdivision in the Municipality of Brighton. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. That brings us to question period. Is there anyone in the public gallery who has a question with anything on with regard to anything on tonight's agenda? Anyone on Zoom? Thank you. We have no in-camera session this evening. Brings us to our confirmatory bylaw, moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council gives a bylaw its first, second, and third reading and finally passes on this date. Being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the Corporation of the Municipality of Brighton Council meeting held on March 20th, 2023. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. And finally, a motion moved by Deputy Mayor Anderson, seconded by Councillor Wielden, that the March 20th, 2023 planning meeting adjourn at 8:20 PM. Any discussion? Those in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. Be well and drive safe, everyone.